Hello and welcome back to Lilly Code. Today we're continuing with the coding alphabet, where I go through common terms and technologies used in coding that you'll need to know when you come into the industry. So let's get going. Today the words I've chosen for the letters G and H are GET and HTTP, which are tightly linked. So let's get into it and I'll explain what these two words mean and what they've got to do with coding. So for this, we'll just come over to our file here. I have my Visual Studio Code open and I'm just going to talk you through some of these ideas. So basically what a HTTP request is a hypertext transfer protocol, and what this allows you to do is interact with a server and return data back to the web browser. So if you want to access some data on a server and display it on your web page, you would use, or you can use, a HTTP request to do this. It's a very common way to retrieve data. So some of the common HTTP requests that we would use, as we can see here in the file, is create, read, update, and delete. And these are known as CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. CRUD, it's an acronym for these four particular words. So you'll hear this a lot when you want to add or edit or delete some data. You can use a HTTP request. So for example, if you have a blog and you want to add a new blog post, you would use the create functionality or the HTTP post request, which would post a new piece of information to the server in order to save it there so you can then display it on your web page. If you wanted to read the data or just have a look at it, you would use a GET request, and this will get back that data from the web server in order for you to display it on your web page. If you wanted to update the data, so for example, if you wanted to update a particular blog post, you could use a HTTP post or patch request. So there are two ways that you can update the data, say for a blog, if that's the application you're using it for. And then if you wanted to delete a blog post altogether, remove it from the server, remove it from your web page, you would use a delete HTTP request. So what type of responses can you expect to get back? So when you send one of these requests to the web server, it'll send you back a status code which tells you whether or not it's been successful. And this is how you know whether or not you've got that data, and you can investigate if something has gone wrong if you haven't got that data. So once you, and we're going to have a look at this in depth now in a moment. I'm going to go through a code example as you can see it here on the screen. So we'll go through that in depth in a moment. But if you wanted to do a post request, if you get back a successful post request and you've created perhaps a new blog post that you'd like to display on your web page, you would get back a 201 message, and this tells you that that request was indeed successful. So we'll see that now in action in the network tab. So that's what's going on there. You would get back a 201, which means it was a successful request. If you want to get the data back and you try and retrieve the data using a GET request, which we're going to look at the GET request now in more detail. If you want to get a request, if everything was okay and you got back the data, no problem, the server could find that particular piece of data, you would get back a 200 response. And the 200 response means everything is okay, perfect, we've got your data. If something went wrong, you would get a 404 response back. And you've probably seen this before in particular web pages where you might click on a link or try and navigate to a certain page and it says 404, request not found, which just means it couldn't find that particular piece of information. So say if you have a list of users on a particular web server and you retrieve back all those users and you have users say from 1 to 10, but you try and get user 11, which hasn't been created yet, you haven't posted user 11 to that server, so it doesn't exist, you'll get back a 404, meaning the resource could not be found. So these are common things that you'll see them when you're using web browsers. And now we're going to go through how to actually code and do this in live, in practice, so you have a bit more of an idea of what's going on when we're using a HTTP request. If you wanted to update the data on the page, you could use a push or a patch. And if everything was successful coming back, just like the GET or the read request, and if everything was successful coming back, just like the GET request, you get back a 200 response, the same as the GET. And if it was unsuccessful, you get a 204 response, again meaning it couldn't find that data in order to update it. So you get a slightly different response. It's 204 because it couldn't get the initial data in order to do that update for you. And then if you wanted to delete a piece of information from a web server, a blog post, or another piece of information you had on your website, then you would use the delete request. And by using a HTTP delete request, you're telling it to get rid of this particular entry, and if successful, you're going to again get back a 200, which is status okay, everything went well, you have your data. So you would get back a 200 request if you've successfully deleted that post, and if something went wrong, you would get back a 204, just like in the case of the put. So it couldn't find that information, it couldn't retrieve the data in order to delete it, it couldn't find the thing that you want to delete, or it couldn't find the thing that you want to update. So that's what we're going to have a look at today, and let's have a look at a code example in plain old JavaScript and HTML with a little bit of CSS thrown in. So let's have a look at that now and go through the motions. So here you can see my index.html page. I'll just start here and go through and explain what's going on. So in a HTML page, first of all, you declare doctype HTML, which just tells the browser this is a HTML page. It just defines it as a HTML page, and then you can continue with your coding. We've gone through this before in previous videos, so I won't spend too much time. You can tell it what language your particular page is in. Here I have it in English. And then you have your head, which is just information for the browser, and your body, which is the content that's going to be shown on your web page. So in our body, all we have here is a div with a class of container. So then in our CSS file, we have .container, and we're telling it what we want this container to do. So we just want it to display flex. Flex is just a way of displaying your content on your page in an easy way. It's a relatively new concept, and it's fantastic because it just makes styling and laying out your web pages much easier when you're using Flex. So that's great. I'll do a video on Flex and we can speak about that in more depth. So do have a look at that. And then we just want to justify the content in the center, which again, once you've declared Flex, you can then use things like justify content, which is just going to stick it in the middle. Instead of adding padding and trying to move it around with just plain old CSS, Flex does it much easier for you. It'll just center it for you with these two simple commands. So that's what's going on there. And then we just have a button, and because this isn't a class name, it's actually the button tag itself, we can access that directly. So we don't need the dot, and we just give some styling for the button, just so the button doesn't look plain and boring. I've just given it some simple styling. So that's all that's going on there. So then once we have our class container defined, so I did do an example with a fetch button, but that's not for today's lesson, so we'll leave that out for the moment. I just had that commented out, but we don't need to worry about that. So I have a button here with the ID of get, and this ID is important because that's how we're going to access this button in order to add an event on click in our JavaScript file. So this ID is how we're going to access that button in this particular example, how we're doing it here. So that's why I've added this ID, so we can nail into this particular component and do something with it on click when we click this button. And the button just says, get me the data. Very simple. So this is the text that's shown on the button in between the opening and closing button tags. So here's the opening and here's the closing. So then we'll just go over to our JavaScript file and see what's going on and how we're actually getting this response, what we're getting, how we're getting it back from the server, and have a look at that. And you'll see the data coming back and everything. So let's have a look at our JavaScript file. So we've already gone through this comments. So that's just what HTTP requests are. So here we've defined a constant, which the name of it is get button. And what we want to do with this get button is go to the document and get the element by ID get, which is why I was telling you that ID is important, because now we can get that element and tell it to do something when we have the element. And what we want to tell it to do, now this get button is linked to that particular piece of HTML in the HTML file. It's getting that particular block of code with the ID. And what we want to do is when we have the button, add an event listener, and on click, run this function. So that's what we're telling it to do here. Once we have this button, which is just the element with the ID of get. We want to add an event listener, so we want to listen. So we want to append some functionality to this particular button. So we wanted to listen to an event, and the event we wanted to listen to is on click. So once we click that button, we want to run this function, get data. And our get data function is defined up here. So all we're doing is, first of all, I'm just going to console log out get, which that's just for my own purposes, just to show you that the method is running. It'll say get and in the console, and you know that it's getting that data. Then we have declared this XHR, the request, which what we want that to be is a new XML HTTP request. And this is how you can get HTTP requests in your JavaScript file, by using this inbuilt XML HTTP request functionality. And this allows you to use these HTTP requests such as get, post, put, delete, patch. So by defining a new XML HTTP request, that allows us to do these different functionalities. So then I've named this XML HTTP request. So the first thing you do is you do a .open, and what the .open does is just sets it up to do that request for you. So it sets it up to do the request. So what we wanted to do is set it up to use a get request, because that's what we want to do. We want to get data back from the server in this particular example. If you wanted to do a delete, you'd put delete in here. If you wanted to do a post, you'd put post in here. And then you also pass in the URL of which you want to get that data back from. So this is just a test URL. This is available online for people to use, and you can go ahead and use it and test out your own HTTP GET request. So I'll include that link in the description box below for you to play around with yourself. So do have a look at that. So then what we also do here is we tell it that we want this XML request to be of a response type of JSON, which all this is doing is telling it when we get back this data, we want the response to be in a JSON format. And this is just a handy way to look at the data. It's a handy way to use your data when it's coming back in a JSON format. Another way to do this would be to use json.parse and then pass in the request.response. And what this does, and what also just sending it straight back as a JSON, they're the same thing. We could have done it either way. It transforms it to a JSON from the raw data that was first coming back. So it's just going to transform it into an easily accessible and usable format for you, which is the JSON format. So that's what we're doing there. We're telling it, give it back to me in a JSON format, because this is easier to use further down the line, depending on your application. So then we actually send the request, and we do that by this method, the request.onload. So we're getting our XML HTTP request and we're saying, go and do this now. So we've defined a function, and all the function is doing is getting the request, and all the function is doing is getting the request.response and putting that into the constant called data. So we're just capturing our response back from the server in a JSON format, because we've already told it that we want the response type to be of a JSON format, and we're just adding that to the constant called data, and then we're sending the request. So this is a very simple example of a HTTP GET request, and now we'll see it in action. So let's go over to our browsers and check out what exactly is happening when we click this button, and we can see the data coming back now. So here I have my web browser. I'll just clear this so you can see it fresh. And we have our button, get me the data, with our various levels of, with our various CSS that we just added on there. So that's all that button is doing. So if we now click our button, get me the data, we can see here we've got back our users in our network tab. So the network records what's coming in and going out. It's the network traffic of your site. So this is where your responses are captured. So now we have our developer tools open. We're looking at our network tab, which is recording what's going in and out of this web page from the network requests that we're sending and receiving. So if we click get me the data, we'll see here we've sent our request. And our request was to get back the users from this test API. So this is just the URL of the API. This is the web page that we want to get back the data from. And on that page, there is a page called /users, which has this data for us ready to be retrieved. It's a test API that you can use yourself. So here we can see in our response, when we get our response back, we have our status of 200, which means it was successful. We successfully got that data back. And say perhaps if I change this and make this some crazy number, save it, and we'll go back and click that button again. I'm expecting to get a failed response now because this data should not exist. So now we see what I was talking about with that 404. This was a failed response. It could not find the data at that page. So it sent back a 404 because it does not exist. So here we can see our get response gave back a 404. It can't get that data. So that's what's going on there. So if we just go back to the way it was, we just want the list of all users which currently exists. There was no user with an ID of 3080 or whatever number I put in. There was no user at that particular URL, so it couldn't find it. It didn't exist. It couldn't return it to us. But the users does exist at this particular test API because that's the way it's been set up. So if we click the button again and we get back our data, we see here we have our users, and in our response here we can see the data, what it was that this user's API call actually contained. So here's our response. Our response was successful. If we go back to our headers here, have a look at our headers, we can see 200, it's status code okay. We can see the green light there, everything is okay. And for the 404, that light would have been red, so it would not have retrieved it. But we've got it back because this URL has this data that we're trying to get, and we're using a HTTP request in order to get back that data. And you can see here also you have the date that the request was made, and other information. So you have your headers, you can pass in information in your headers. So our request was successful. We have our data back, and here we can see all of the different HTTP methods that we could have used. We have get, head, post, push, delete, connect, options, trace, and patch. So I've spoke about a few of them, and I'm going into depth on the get request right now for getting data back using a HTTP request way of getting back some data. So you can also do this through libraries, and there's other ways to get back data, but HTTP requests are very common and it's great to know how to use them. So let's just do a brief introduction of what it is all about here and now. So I'm here to give you an overview of what it all means, and so you understand what this word means when you come into the coding industry. What's a HTTP request? It's just a way of getting data back from the server. What's a HTTP GET request? It specifically is the HTTP request for getting data back, whereas a HTTP delete request will be a way of deleting data from the server. So hopefully this makes it a little bit clearer. So we'll continue to go through our developer tools here now and go through the various tabs in the network to explain what else is going on here after we've clicked this button and got back our data. So we can see in our headers everything was okay, and then in the preview you have the information that came back from that server. You can have a look at it here, and then you can loop it, you can display it on your web page, but you've got the data ready to be displayed on the web page. So that's what we're doing here now. So we can see that the data on this particular server is set up as follows, and depending on the different APIs that you're going to be requesting data from and how that data is structured on the server, this may look different. Perhaps they don't have the per page. Perhaps they have another attribute there like the author, and it'll give the author that wrote that particular piece of data. So it can come back in different fashions depending on how it's set up. But the big thing is once you get the 200, you know it's okay. If you've got a 404, something is wrong and it can't find the data. So that's good to know. That's what's going on there. So if we have a look at the data that's came back here, we have an object that we have an array of various objects here. So we have loads of different objects contained in an array that's come back from the server. So let's have a look at the first item in the array, which I've also discussed in previous videos. The first item in an array is found at location 0. Arrays start at location 0, not at location 1. So the first one will be at 0 here. So the data that this particular API is sending back is it has an avatar, which is just an image, an email, so a person's email, their first name, an ID, and their last name. So this will be the same for each of these particular entries, only the information will be different. So here we have a second avatar, a second email, second first name, ID, and last name for the second entry in the array, which is at location 1 in that array. So that's what's going on. We've successfully retrieved some data from our server with our HTTP GET request. So I hope that this brief overview of what a HTTP GET request is and what HTTP is in general has assisted you to understand these concepts a little bit better. So thank you for joining me, and I hope that this was helpful. Have a wonderful day. Thanks.